Okay. Sorry about that. As I was mentioning earlier, yeah, we have got now about 15 to 18 people on Webex already, who's in the talk. Meanwhile, we also have got some of our lecturers who are projecting the talk in their class. So the number of attendees are actually more than those that we have. Throughout the talk, we will appreciate if you have questions, you can type it into the chat box, and then we will address them after the talk, unless it's something that Dr. Casey would like to address halfway. Otherwise, we will wait until the end, and then we will address your questions. Okay, just a quick introduction about Dr. Casey. He's currently the Deputy Head of School at the School of Computing and Information Technology at our University of Wollongong, Australia. Dr. Casey's research areas include areas of interactive real-time interfaces and cybersecurity. So our students who are doing human-computer interaction in the class now will find that to be somewhat associated to what you're learning, and I'm sure you will pick up some important insights and information as well. Okay, so I hope that this session will be fruitful to all of us, and that we will be able to learn or share some ideas and pick up important information of what the future holds, and this whole talk about the metaverse and the kind of technologies that is within it from our colleague and our well-respected colleague and lecturer from the University of Wollongong, Australia. So Dr. Casey, you have shared your screen. I think you can test. You might want to test a bit of the sound and everything, and then you can start. You want to start now?
Okay, all right. Thanks for the kind introduction, and welcome everyone. I think it's a morning. It's a good morning to everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about cybersecurity in the context of the metaverse. And what I'll do is to give you a bit of an overview of what I'll be covering. I've kind of split this into three different sections. The first section, I'll talk about the metaverse and what the metaverse is in the first place, because obviously a lot of people have different definitions of what it is and what kind of technology it basically entails, and a little bit of an overview of things like the architecture behind the metaverse. And then the second part, I'll talk about the metaverse from a cybersecurity perspective. So obviously, if you think about any form of technology that we have nowadays, there are going to be, so there's a lot of interference. Let me, okay, yep. So obviously with any form of technology, there's obviously going to be a lot of malicious entities and adversaries who will want to exploit the situation. So I'll talk a little bit about things like the threats and potential attacks in the metaverse. And then the third section, I'll talk about things like research directions of what people are working in and how some of these threats can be alleviated. So through things like countermeasures and things like that. And I'll finish off with some concluding remarks. So to start off with, and by the way, feel free to, if you have any questions, feel free to actually put it in the chat. I'll monitor the chat. So if you have any questions, by all means, just put it in the chat. So let me start with the first part on the metaverse. So what is the metaverse in the first place? So for those of you who don't know, it's really a combination of two words, meta being Greek for, if we translate this, it basically means transcendence. Transcendence in terms of something beyond the normal, beyond the physical world. So that's meta. And verse is basically short form for universe. So you combine them together, you get metaverse. Now, where did this term actually come from? Is it a new term? Is it something that is it like a recent development in recent years? Because previously not many people used the term. Nowadays it's all over the media. People see it all over the place. So where did this term actually come from? Now, the origins of the metaverse is really from science fiction. So it's a writer by the name of Neil Stevenson, if I remember correctly. He wrote a novel in the 90s, I think 92, where he talked about this metaverse, where, and the idea behind this, what he wrote in his novel was a virtual space where people and AI through avatars, they actually interacted within this virtual space using things like virtual reality equipment and so on and so on. So it was seen as this parallel digital world that people could actually interact in. So that's where the term basically came from. And so you can see it's not a new term. But so what is the metaverse in the first place? So it's really a digital virtual world. I mean, the science fiction writer basically wrote it that way, but even these days we actually use the term similarly. It's basically a digital world that is parallel to our physical world. So it's something that is persistent in the sense that even if a person logs out of the metaverse, it's actually still there. So people can log in, log out of the metaverse. It's persistent, and it's actually meant to be immersive. So what you're trying to do is to uh, through things like wearable devices and sensors, you're trying to fool a human's uh, senses into believing that they're actually in that online world or online universe. Now, a lot of people will say that, oh, okay, this is like science fiction because obviously the origins for this was from science fiction in the first place, from a novel, in a science fiction novel. But
Hi,
sorry, I mean,
sorry to interrupt, Dr. Casey. We will appreciate if participants could mute your microphone. Thank you very much.
all right, thanks. So let me continue. So yeah, so I was basically saying that a lot of people will say that okay, the metaverse is kind of science fiction. It's not going to become a reality. But then proponents of this will basically say that people used to say that about the internet as well. So if you think way back in the 70s or the 80s, there was the vision for the internet, and a lot of people were saying that this is hype. It's not going to eventuate. There's no such thing as this, information superhighway and that. And nowadays, obviously, the internet is a reality, and most of us can't even think about life without the internet in its current form. So, will the metaverse become a reality, or is it in the realm of science fiction? Well, in some form or other, to me, it will actually become a reality in some form or other. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's the vision that we see now, but in some sense, it will actually uh, become more prevalent in the society today. Because again, if you think about how the world has basically evolved, uh, so in fact, I'll talk about Second Life a little bit. So I had somebody put in the chat what about Second Life. I'll talk a little bit about that. In fact, right after this. So um, in terms of how it will actually evolve, we don't really know, but in some form or other, it will actually take place because, as I mentioned earlier, it's like, for instance, what we talk about in terms of video conferencing now. If you think about the COVID era now, nobody would have thought that things like virtual uh, video conferencing would actually become the mainstay, WebEx, Zoom, and so on and so forth. Whereas now, pretty much, we can't live without it. And we were kind of forced into this because if you think about pre-COVID days, people hardly used it. But once COVID hit, then we were actually forced to doing everything online. So to me, the metaverse is similar. Somehow or rather, it will actually eventuate in one form or another. Now, how do we actually interact with this metaverse? So this is an area that's basically called extended reality, or XR for short. Now, extended reality is really an umbrella term that covers a number of different areas, if you like. The first is basically virtual reality. So let me explain a little bit the difference behind them. So virtual reality is where you attempt to cover the user's senses, and what you project is a completely virtual world. So there's nothing real in the world. It's completely virtual. Whereas augmented reality or AR, augmented reality is where you see the real physical world and you overlay virtual content onto the real world. So you're seeing the real world, but there are some overlays of virtual content on it. And mixed reality is kind of seen as a mix between the two, where what mixed reality actually tries to do is you can see some part of it as the real world, you can see some part as the virtual world. And when you interact with things, you can actually interact with physical objects that have a virtual significance to them. So for instance, if you put some sensors on an object and you move it around, it will also move in the virtual world. So extended reality is an umbrella term that covers these different areas. So that's how we are meant to actually interact with this parallel digital world. Now, is the metaverse a new concept? Well, no, it's not, because as I mentioned, the term basically came about in the early 90s in the first place. And a lot of people have been thinking about these ideas in a lot of different places. If you think about science fiction movies, Star Trek, a lot of people used to talk about the holodeck in Star Trek. That's kind of a metaverse. Some of the recent movies, things like Ready Player One, so Ready Player One is something that is more akin to what we would actually think of in terms of how we would actually interact with the metaverse, where you have to wear certain wearable devices in order to actually interact with this digital virtual world. Whereas the other extreme of that, which is movies like The Matrix, this is pretty much where we talk about you jack into the Matrix, and that is pretty much it covers your entire senses, because it plugs directly into the human brain, and the virtual world and the digital world is actually directly projected into the brain, which affects all the human senses, and so on and so forth. So that's obviously the extreme. Most of the time, we don't really want to talk about intrusive type systems, because that basically means that you actually have to have surgery or something to actually plug something into your physical body. Most of the time, it's just wearing something, right? So as to the question, what about Second Life? Does it still exist? So somebody basically asked this in the chat. So that's basically seen as one of the early virtual worlds, because it's not really a video game in that sense, because there's no real objective of a game in Second Life. It's pretty much a persistent online world that people can do whatever they actually want in the world. So does it still exist? Well, it's kind of still around, but nobody really uses it as much anymore, because there's kind of not much objective to it. It used to be really, really popular around the mid 2000s, I believe. Used to be really popular then. And a lot of people was also saying that the Second Life was a bit of hype as well, because Linden Labs, which were the developers of Second Life, they tried to overinflate some of the numbers of people using Second Life. But it was, regardless of what people say, it was popular at some stage. And nowadays, if you think about things like video games, that is part of the metaverse as well, because if you think about the definition of the metaverse, where you have a persistent online world that you can do various things in it. So some video games pretty much actually meet the definition, but we will know very well that for video games, there's a very specific purpose for playing a video game. Unlike the metaverse, where you're supposed to be able to do a lot more things than what is limited in a video game type setting. So having said that, then what can we actually do in the metaverse? So the metaverse, as I mentioned, it's meant to be a parallel online digital world. So pretty much whatever you can actually do in the real world, the vision is you can actually do that in the metaverse as well. So obviously you can socialize with other people. This is much like how we do this on WebEx or Zoom, but this will obviously be in a 3D setting, because if you wear things like a virtual reality headset, you can see other people in this three-dimensional world. So you can socialize with people. You can have things like digital art, where when you interact with other people, you interact through virtual avatars. So avatars are like the either humanoid form or your representation, your three-dimensional representation of yourself in that three-dimensional world. So you can wear various things in the virtual world. You can even have digital art. You can have paintings and digital sculptures. That was a bit soft. Is this better? Try to adjust this a bit. Yeah, I can't actually adjust the volume. Let me try to speak a bit louder.
Can you log in also? Doing hard login. So I'm projecting this as well. So BK students, can you hear that?
Okay, cool. So let me try to speak a bit louder. So what can we actually do in what type of activities can we actually perform in the metaverse? So I was basically talking about socializing with other people through a digital form. You can obviously have things like entertainment. You can have things like concerts. You can have events. All that can take place in the metaverse. You can attend online classes for education. You can even buy and sell property. That can be physical property. It can even be virtual property in the digital world itself. And if you think about this is actually not a new concept, because the virtual world that I mentioned previously, Second Life, people actually bought real estate in Second Life. And this actually, it's not like tens of dollars or hundreds of dollars. It goes into the millions. There's a very famous story where somebody actually bought an asteroid in, it's completely virtual. It's a virtual asteroid in Second Life. They paid $1 million for that virtual asteroid. And immediately after the person bought it for $1 million, somebody actually offered the person 2 million to actually buy that asteroid from the original buyer. So, even digital assets have some value to it. And part of the reason why these digital assets have certain value is because the draw of Second Life was that companies would actually be involved in that virtual universe. They would actually try to market stuff. They would actually put their advertisements there for people. So things like Nike, things like Coca-Cola, they all pretty much bought a share in that virtual world. So yes, so somebody mentioned predecessor to NFT. That's perfectly correct. So obviously you can do commerce in the virtual world, e-commerce. You can shop, you can buy stuff, and that can actually translate to the physical world as well, because you can buy something in the virtual world, and that can actually translate to something in the physical world. For example, you can buy clothing in the virtual world. You can shop to browse clothing, and then when you buy it, somebody will actually be delivered to your house. So that translates to something in the physical world. So hello to people from Penang. So hello from obviously Wollongong. And obviously, given things like the COVID situation, where pretty much we do a lot of things online nowadays, people talk about work from home. So in the metaverse, once the metaverse becomes a reality, then the same thing can actually happen, because everything is digitally connected. A lot of what you may not actually necessarily have to be physically in office, so you can actually do that in through virtual offices. Now, this image that you see here. This is basically an image from Gartner. Now, Gartner is basically a well-recognized research company, and what they pretty much stated was their prediction is that by close to the end of this decade, so around 2026, they basically said that they predict that at least 25% of people's time will be, in some form or other, be devoted to the metaverse. So people will, and as you can kind of see it nowadays anyway, that a lot of our time is actually spent in terms of Zoom or WebEx. So a lot of time is actually spent in the virtual world anyway. Now, having said that, what are some of the benefits of the metaverse? Why do we even want to have something like metaverse in the first place? Now, for one thing, it's actually meant to be the next iteration of the internet. If you think about the way that the internet has basically evolved, initially it started, just a way of communicating. Then people talk about things like Web 2.0, where it moved into things like mobile devices and devices that people used every day, like tablets or smart phones, IoT. And Internet 3.0 is actually meant to be something like a distributed environment. And so the metaverse is part of that. It's actually seen as the next evolution of the internet. And some of the advantages are things like, obviously, it doesn't have any geometrical or geographical boundaries, because if you think about metaverse, you can actually be in the same environment as anybody around the world. There's no limitations of geographical distances. And also, if you think about things, there's no limitations in terms of the physical body as well, because this is especially relevant for for things like potentially, let's say, disabled people. So if somebody's disabled in the physical world, then there are certain limitations to that. But in the virtual world, people don't even know that a person may actually be disabled in real life. So it obviously overcomes the physical barriers as well. It's a form of escapism, what some people say, because if you're kind of tired with your real physical life, then you can go into this digital world and experience life in a different sense or different point of view. And some people argue that it can potentially reduce the carbon footprint as well, because once you have something like the metaverse and you can enter into this metaverse, you don't really need to travel that much anymore. So you will reduce greenhouse gas emissions in terms of, let's say, airplane flights or vehicles like cars. You don't actually need that much anymore. Now, the counter argument to that obviously is that once you have something like the metaverse in full, in all its glory, that actually requires a tremendous amount of energy in order to actually power the metaverse, because you need a lot of computing devices in order to actually run it. So this is where the field of things like green computing or energy efficient computing basically comes in, because as much as possible, you need to be able to reduce the amount of energy that's basically consumed by these metaverse technologies. And that pretty much leads me into the next slide here, which is basically on the technologies that we actually need to make the metaverse become a reality. So obviously, one of the first things or the first technologies we need are things like a virtual and augmented reality type systems, because this is how we engage with the metaverse in the first place. And if you look at this image up the top here, so if you look at this image here, if you notice, if you recognize that person, that's actually me, many years ago. I won't tell you how many, but a number of years ago. And you can pretty much see that I was wearing what I can only describe to be a torture device. And the reason why I say it's a torture device is this many years ago, it was extremely heavy. The resolution was really poor. There was a significant lag. And as you can see, there's no wireless trackers or wireless sensors or anything. It's a mechanical arm, which again adds a lot of weight. And there are a lot of limitations to this, because you cannot really move very far. So it was incredibly cumbersome, and I had to use that for a number of years. So this is why I have nightmares about it. I call it a torture device. But nowadays, technology has basically improved a lot, right? So in those days, if you were to ask me, will the metaverse become a reality? I would basically pretty much tell you no way, because it's too cumbersome, it's too difficult to actually use. But nowadays, if you think about what we have, so this is basically the Oculus Quest 2 headset. It's much lighter and much better resolutions, wireless, much better processor. You have things like a lot more sensors, and it's a lot better than what we used to have. And even the costs for that matter. So what I was wearing here, that actually cost Australian currency. That cost $20,000 back then when I was basically using it. Whereas what you have now, this Oculus Quest 2, last I checked, it was around 600-ish Australian dollars. So it's a huge price difference, and it's a lot more affordable now, because it's even cheaper than an iPhone 14. Right? iPhone 14, if you want to buy that, you probably have to eat instant noodles for a month in order to actually purchase an iPhone 14, whereas this headset itself is actually cost less than iPhone 14. So technology has basically caught up a lot, and because of that, that's why people started talking a lot about the metaverse nowadays. And a lot of this is actually driven by some of the major companies, because if you think about the investment of the major companies, Microsoft is heavily invested in the metaverse. Google is heavily invested as well. Apple is heavily invested, and one of the main drivers of the metaverse is basically Facebook, which has pretty much changed their name to Meta, because they see that as the way forward for their company. So if you think about how the world has basically evolved, once major companies put in a lot of money into certain technologies, there's a very high chance that that technology will actually take off. So this is the reason why a lot of people believe that in one form or another, the metaverse will actually become a reality. Now, it may not be in the form that people think it will actually come out as, but in some form or other, it will actually take place. So what other technologies do we actually need? Now, the metaverse is meant to be powered by artificial intelligence because you cannot have people monitoring the metaverse all the time. You actually need artificial intelligence processes to automate a lot of the processes in the metaverse. Cloud technology is basically given because all the data has to be stored somewhere, and that's where cloud technology comes in. Blockchain obviously is part of that as well because it needs to be distributed, because part of the response time for metaverse, it has to be real time. So you need to somehow distribute the data so that the responses in the virtual world can actually be as immediate as possible. Internet of Things basically comes in, or IoT, because you have a lot of sensors and small little devices to track all the movements of people in the real world in order to actually translate that to the virtual world. And obviously networking has to be a big part of this because you cannot have delays in the metaverse. Otherwise, that will actually destroy the experience that people basically have. So this is an example of a very high level overview of what the architecture of a metaverse can actually look like. And as you can see here, what this actually tries to do is, metaverse is meant to combine the digital world with the physical world and the human world. So it's actually meant to be a cross between these three different domains. And it's actually meant to be done in a seamless manner. And what that actually means, so for example, you can see that right here, you can interact with the metaverse using XR equipment. Potentially, you can even use what's called brain-computer interfaces. So you can wear these sensors that track your thoughts or the brainwave patterns that can actually control stuff in the virtual world. So that's basically how you interact with it. Then there's obviously artificial intelligence that controls things like scene generation, recommendation systems. You need things like 3D modeling in that to create the virtual environments that we have and the digital avatars. You have things like commerce, as I mentioned, you can actually buy and sell stuff in the virtual world. So you need things like blockchain, smart contracts, non-fungible tokens or NFTs. All that basically needs to be there for things like virtual goods and services. There's a whole variety of activities you can do. You can see you can have entertainment, you can have events, you can have parties, and different virtual worlds. And you're meant to be able to hop or jump between these different virtual worlds. So that's all in the digital world. But at the same time, the humans in the human world need to be able to interact with that digital world, obviously. And humans can also interact with the physical world. So things in the physical world. And physical world, we obviously have things like our computation equipment, like computers and so on and so forth, sensors like mobile devices, storage devices, the cloud. And there's meant to be a feedback loop with the digital world. So there's this concept known as digital twin. What does a digital twin actually mean? What that actually means is that you have your physical objects in the physical world, and these physical objects have a digital twin in the metaverse. And what that actually means is that if you interact with the physical object, it's meant to have implications on the digital object. If you interact with the digital object in the digital world, it's meant to have implications on the physical object. So simple example would be if you have a physical object and you put some sensors on that object, if you touch the object or you manipulate the object in the real world, the sensors will actually feed that back into the digital world so that it will actually affect the behavior of the digital twin of that object in the virtual world. And similarly, in the digital world, if let's say you purchase that object in the digital world, that goes through, let's say, if it's tied to a NFT or something, then that object actually becomes yours in the physical world. So the idea behind the digital twin is that if you interact with it in the physical world, it has implications on the same object in the digital world. If you interact with it in the digital world, it also has some implications on objects in the physical world. So that's obviously what the concept of digital twin refers to. Now, what are some characteristics of this metaverse and the link between the human, the physical, and the digital world. So some of the characteristics are things like immersiveness, where the metaverse is meant to be something that's immersive. And what that actually means is that a human can actually immerse themselves completely in that digital world without really kind of bothering about what's basically in the physical world. It's meant to be hyperspatial temporal. And what that actually means is that if you think about the physical world, there are limits to the physical world. The physical world is not infinite. There are boundaries, there are walls that you cannot surpass, and you cannot, and time only travels in one direction. You cannot go back through time. Now, in the metaverse, it's actually meant to be able to transcend that because there's no real physical boundaries in the digital world. The boundaries are basically what the developers of the metaverse basically put in. So you can actually transcend those boundaries because it's kind of infinite in terms of space, and potentially you can even go back through time because of the fact that whatever you have in, let's say, a virtual environment, you can actually change that by changing things to do with the history of that virtual environment, because it's up to the developer of that how you can actually control time in a virtual world. It's meant to be sustainable, obviously, because once you set up the metaverse, it's actually meant to be able to continue. Scalable, because you need to be able to keep increasing the number of applications, the number of virtual worlds in that, the number of users. And heterogeneity refers to the fact that the different devices or different ways you operate with this can actually be different. So one person might have a virtual reality device, another person might interact with it using an augmented reality device. And these devices can be developed by different manufacturers, different companies. They may look different, behave different, but you can still interact with the metaverse using these different types of devices. And so that being the architecture of the metaverse, now that obviously involves a lot of different techniques, and a lot of these are techniques that people are studying nowadays. It's a really, really hot field. So things like, for example, neural interfaces. These are like what I mentioned, things like brain-computer interfaces, where you can wear sensors that detect your brain waves, and that actually allows you to interact with different things. Because if you think of something different, your brain waves will actually change. So given those signals, you can actually try to interpret what those signals actually mean and try to control stuff in a digital world. Digital twin, I mentioned the concept of digital twin earlier. And what that actually tries to do is you have a physical object, you have a digital twin, which is a twin of that object. And whatever you do to one or the other, it actually affects the other one, right? So that's what the digital twin basically refers to. Networking, obviously, we need really ultra reliable, low latency ways of communicating, because any delays in communication in the metaverse will actually affect the performance of the user and it will affect the user's experience. So if you think about the technologies that we have nowadays, nowadays we are moving to 5G, 6G, there's a minimum bandwidth requirement, and there has to be a certain maximum latency. So as technology basically improves, then these communication channels will actually become better. NLP basically refers to natural language processing. If you think about, again, the metaverse, it's actually meant to transcend languages. So you can interact. So if you speak a certain language, you can actually interact with somebody else that speaks a completely different language, because it's actually meant to be translated in real time, whether it's from speech to text or even translating speech to speech in a different language. So there's a lot of research that's going on in natural language processing. Machine vision, that covers both the extended reality in terms of virtual reality, augmented reality, and mixed reality. And also, if you think about how we interact with things in the metaverse, it's all about the visual sensors, right? There are three-dimensional avatars, there are three-dimensional virtual environments in the metaverse, and a lot of that can be automated and recognized using things like computer vision or machine vision. And blockchain basically comes in as well, because if you think about data and how do you share data, distributed data, that's obviously blockchain. Security and privacy, how you manage that, smart contracts, all that ties in with things like blockchain. So all these are pretty much a lot of techniques that people are actually looking at, because these techniques will actually be in some form or another, in some form or another, it will actually be some of the techniques that are basically used in the metaverse. Okay, so that's pretty much the first part of this talk on the metaverse. The next part I'll talk about, okay, given that, okay, this is what the metaverse is. What about the cybersecurity challenges in the metaverse? So how is the metaverse from a cybersecurity perspective of looking at this? So I've given you an idea of the metaverse, and I basically mentioned that metaverse involves a lot of different technologies and a lot of different techniques, right? And with all these different technologies and all these techniques, they have to actually come together in order to actually form the metaverse, right? So we know that as a fact. And with so many technologies, there's going to be a lot of data and information that's actually going to be transmitted to and fro in order to actually drive the human experience. Because if you think about wearing these wearable devices, you have to send information to it for it to actually render the scene. When you interact with something, all the sensors will actually feed that information back, and you have to send that back to the engine of the metaverse. So there's going to be a lot of communication and a lot of traffic in that, and you need a lot of data to actually share that. You also need things like wearable devices and the hardware to actually drive this metaverse. Now, if you think about all those different technologies and all those different devices, there's going to be a lot of ways that you can actually attack this, because each one of those technologies already has methods that you can actually attack them. And when you put all of them together, there's even going to be a greater number of avenues for actually attacking the metaverse. And you can also do so in not just a digital sense. If you think about a lot of cyber attacks now, it's all, well, most of them anyway, are from the digital attacks. But because of the fact that when you attempt to use the metaverse, you have to actually use these physical devices. That actually translates to physical methods of attacking actual humans. And I'll mention some examples of how you can actually do that a little bit later on. But it is actually possible because of the fact that you have to wear these devices in order to actually interact with the metaverse. So there's a much larger attack surface because there are a lot more avenues that you can actually attack. And because of this, this is why it's actually critical to actually address this cybersecurity issue in the metaverse. Because if these security and privacy issues are not addressed, then that's like the death of the metaverse, because you cannot use it for anything proper. You may be able to play games with it, you may be able to socialize in it, but that's pretty much it. There's no way you can actually do things like commerce in it, or real estate or anything like that, because there's just too many vulnerabilities in the metaverse for any practical use. And obviously the reason for that is because if you think about the characteristics of the metaverse, there's a lot of things that are actually involved in it. There is obviously a lot of data, there's the software aspect, hardware aspect, networking, AI, algorithms, there's a human aspect. So there's a lot of different factors to actually consider. And all these different factors have ways that you can actually attack them. So if you're a hacker, if you are a malicious user, you can actually find ways to exploit a lot of these different situations. It's multimodal in the sense that it's not just text, or it's not just images that you see on screen, or not just video, because it's the idea behind the immersiveness of the metaverse is it's supposed to actually immerse all the person's or human's senses. So from the visual senses, it's meant to display virtual content. Your human ear is supposed to listen to various things, even things like your tactile feedbacks. When you touch certain things, it's supposed to actually give that feedback as well. So there's a lot more avenue for malicious activity in the metaverse. There are things like real-time performance. So if you think about if the traditional internet, for instance, now obviously people are not happy with latency. If certain things get delayed, people are not happy. But in the metaverse, if there are delays, that will completely destroy the user's experience. So it has to be real-time performance. So there are a lot of things like let's say security mechanisms that we have nowadays, which they are secure mechanisms, but they take a long time to actually compute. And in the metaverse, you cannot afford that because everything has to be done in real time. You cannot, for example, if you implement encryption or decryption algorithms to secure data, that can potentially take a long time. And you cannot really afford to take such a long time encrypting data or decrypting data because the things have to actually react or behave in real time in the metaverse. And it's also persistent. So it's not like you turn on your computer, you turn it off, then everything gets wiped. It's actually persistent. So whatever you do in the metaverse, it's actually recorded somewhere. So that's the reason why there's a lot of different aspects to actually consider in order to secure the metaverse. And part of the problem with this as well is that because in this day and age, so if you talk about right now, there is no real there are some aspects of the metaverse, things like Second Life, things like some video games. Facebook has a prototype of the metaverse, but there's no real full-blown metaverse yet. So a lot of these threats or these risk and cyber threats, we can only predict what will actually happen. We don't really know because of the fact that we don't really have an actual metaverse yet. And once we do have such a metaverse, then you'll find that there'll be a lot more people that can actually find ways or indeed new ways to actually attack the metaverse. So a lot of the threats are predicted, but we don't really know the threat yet. So we can only base our information on what we know of the current technology and to try to protect against the potential threats. But once you actually have a metaverse, then potentially you have even more threats occurring. So let's have a look at some of the potential things that attackers can actually do. So one of the areas that they can actually exploit is what is known as identity security. So if you think about a person's identity in a digital world, person obviously has to have a digital identity because how do you identify that the person is really the person that they claim themselves to be, right? But the way you interact in the metaverse is you have a digital avatar. Your identity is also governed by the digital assets that you have. This will govern things like the financial information, your credit card numbers, your bank account numbers, your contacts, who are your friends, your medical history, especially health records are basically one of the main things why people talk about the advantages of the metaverse. You even have your behavioral and biological data in the metaverse because if you think about this, with all the wearable sensors that you actually have, and your transactions in the metaverse, that actually records your behavior and your biological data. That's how people actually know that it's basically you. And if a person or if a hacker basically steals that data, then they can actually steal your identity. It's basically known as identity theft because once they steal your identity, they can do a lot of things. They can impersonate you for one thing, because remember, this is all digital, right? It's all virtual. So if they impersonate you and they use your avatar, they try to contact people on your social list, how does other people know that how do other people actually know that it's not the actual person itself, right? Or things like identity spoofing. This is like creating a completely fake personality. This is what people do nowadays. If you think about identity spoofing, they create a fake personality and they try to scam other people into whatever. It could be scamming them in terms of relationships, could be scamming them in terms of donating money or buying something. So this is identity spoofing. So with this digital identity in the metaverse, if somebody actually steals the information, they can do a lot of things because everything is really virtual and you have no real way of actually knowing if you don't actually have some authentication mechanisms in order to actually verify that the person is who they say they are. And I'm sure many of you have know of things like deep fake technology. So this was really popular on social media at one stage. I mean, still is. It's a very hot field at the moment, deep fake technology. And the idea behind this is to use things like deep learning tools in order to manipulate things like images and videos to do whatever you want with them. And in a lot of cases, it's to mimic things like celebrities or politicians. Now, the tool itself, so deepfake technology itself, is technology, right? It's not positive or negative. It's not good or bad. It's agnostic. It's really how people use this technology that gives rise to either for positive purposes or negative implications. So for example, if you think about what deepfake technology promises, it promises things, a lot of things in the film production industry, because you no longer actually need the actual actor to act out a lot of scenes anymore. You can have a stunt double, and you can put the actor's face onto the stunt double, so you don't actually need the actual actor to do a lot of these stunts anymore. So that's obviously the positive aspect of it. But the negative aspect is once people harness this technology, they can obviously mimic celebrities or mimic politicians, and they can cause the deepfake to say whatever they want or behave the way whatever however they actually want, and that obviously is very damaging to the person. Now, if you project this into the metaverse, then obviously this problem becomes even more it becomes an even major problem, because everything in the metaverse is digital. So how do you actually know whether or not the person is really the person itself and not a deep fake produced or synthesized person? Now, there are obviously some defense mechanisms behind this. So to give you an example, there are ways that there are the people that are actually trying to develop mechanisms to detect deepfake images or videos. And one of the ways that I obviously mention, one of the ways is, for example, if you think about the human eye, right? The human eye is supposed to reflect certain things in your scene. So one of the ways of actually detecting whether or not it's a real image or a fake image is if you look at the reflections in the eye of the image or video, if there's a mismatch in that, because deepfake images are synthesized, they're not real images. So most of the time, the reflections do not actually match. And in fact, the reflections are complete nonsense because they are not actually looking even at the same thing. Whereas in the real world, they're supposed to actually reflect the actual environment that the person is actually looking at. So that's one of the ways of actually detecting whether or not it's a deep fake image. But the problem obviously is security is an arms race. Once you find a way of detecting something, somebody will try to find a way of defeating that. And once people actually know that, okay, the mechanism for detecting whether or not an image is a fake is through the reflection on the eyes, they can then design better and better deep learning algorithms that will actually try to fix that problem. And it becomes a lot more difficult to detect deepfake using reflections of the eyes, once these techniques basically come out. So that's kind of the reality of the world that we basically live in. So other problems are things like data security problems, because if you think about the metaverse, there's a lot more data that actually goes to the metaverse. Things like wearable devices. When you wear wearable devices, it collects a lot more information. Even things like, for example, biometric data, or your thought. If you use things like brain-computer type interfaces, then that actually detects things like your thought patterns. So there's a lot more. There are new data that will actually be in the metaverse, which people can actually steal. They can tamper with the data. For example, what they can do is, for instance, if you have things like assets in the digital world, they can change the data so that the asset actually belongs to somebody else. So that's basically data tampering. You can inject things like false data. So for example, if you have machine learning algorithms that try to learn patterns, by injecting false data, you get the machine learning algorithm to train on false data that will actually uh, uh, end up detecting other things. So that's like things like false data injection. You can change things like intellectual property, for instance, because everything is basically digital. So you can even manipulate ownership in the digital world. So that's data security. There are privacy concerns, because you think about privacy. Now, privacy, there's a lot of different aspects of privacy. There is things like your personal information, like your name, your socioeconomic status, how much money you have, your social status, your contacts, your medical history. Privacy also involves things like your behavior, because things like your interactions with the metaverse, you can actually track people's habits, what they always do. They can track their choices, what they always select. They can track their activities, at certain times of the day, where are they? And even things like personal communication, when they interact or chat with their friends, you can actually eavesdrop on that to find out certain details about other people. So whenever we talk about digital lives, you cannot track all these information if no mechanisms are uh, in place to actually prevent this privacy leakage. So there's a whole variety of different things that you can actually do. For one thing, there's a concept known as pervasive data collection, because once you actually are living in the metaverse, somehow or rather all your data will actually be collected. Your activities, what you actually do, timestamps of when you actually do it, it's all pretty much there. And some of the problems with doing that is, once people can actually find out your behavior, they can actually translate to, let's say, the physical world. Because if they know that, okay, at so and so time you are always at this cafe in the metaverse, what they can actually do is they can burgle your house or something, because they know very well that you're not actually where you're actually physically, right? So that can actually translate to physical implications. Privacy leakage are things like, if, for example, there are mechanisms to secure data, you can potentially it leaks some information, because, for instance, you might actually use some encryption algorithm to encrypt the data of your actual location. But while using this encrypted data, let's say your system queries some other database for the information about shops in a certain location. So that actually leaks the privacy. So even though the data is encrypted, but you know that your system is actually querying for some information from some other system, and that actually leaks that you know that your system is actually trying to find out information about some location, and you can infer that that's where the person is basically at. So that's basically privacy leakage. And there are other threats like and some of these are even in the metaverses that we have nowadays. You can actually see this. So for example, things like virtual stalking and spying, because and this has actually happened, as I mentioned, because in one of the virtual environments that we have now, Second Life, this was actually a problem, because virtual cameras are not physical cameras. If it's a physical camera, if you think about physical cameras that are located at certain places, you can actually see that the camera is actually there. But in the metaverse, a virtual camera, you don't actually know that it's actually there. No, your people don't actually know that the virtual camera can be following them. A virtual camera can be at some location that observes their activities, because it's all virtual. So if no mechanisms are in place to detect these, virtual cameras, then you can actually put virtual cameras anywhere, and nobody will actually know that people are actually spying on them. So this is obviously a huge problem. There are obviously things like networking threats, network security. So there's a whole variety of things that you can do in terms of network threats. You can eavesdrops on other people. There are things like single point failure attacks. And what this actually means is that in a lot of the current networking situations, you have a centralized server. And in fact, a lot of these video games pretty much have this. You have a centralized server that coordinates all the activities in the virtual world. And the reason why you have a centralized server is because it's easy. It's the cost is lower because you only have one server. It's easy to actually control everything because everything is centralized. So the server makes all the decisions of what basically happens in the virtual world. But the problem with that is that it's a single point of failure. And once people actually know that it's really just a centralized server, you can simply attack that centralized server, and that completely disrupts the virtual world because you only have a single server. So that's a single point of failure. This is the reason why a lot of people are talking about distributed technology now, because you distribute it so that there's no longer a single point of failure, right? Now, other networking threats that you can actually do are things like, let's say, denial of service type attacks, or DDoS. This is a very famous attack, where what you're actually trying to do is with things like all the IoT devices and sensors that we require now to actually enter the metaverse, there's a lot more accounts and a lot more devices that hackers can actually attack. And once the attacker basically compromises these devices, they can use these devices to try to communicate with a metaverse server, and they can actually overload or overwhelm the server, such that the server cannot really give proper service to the legitimate users anymore. So this is basically a distributed denial of service attack. This is very common, even have it nowadays. You can even have things like what are called Sybil attacks. So Sybil attack is basically the concept where if you have certain reputation systems or voting mechanisms in the metaverse, you can actually launch a Sybil attack. And what Sybil attack basically means is that you can generate a lot of fake identities or even steal the identities of other people through, identity theft. If you generate a significant number of them, that gives you a lot of voting rights in certain mechanisms, because the more of these fake, Sybil avatars that you actually have, that basically gives you more influence on a particular system. So, for example, if it's a reputation system, you have a lot more participants that can actually influence the system. Things like if you're familiar with things like blockchain consensus, that basically means that you need a certain consensus for something to actually be done. But if you have a lot of this, you can actually influence that consensus mechanism so that something will actually be decided in your favor. So this is what a Sybil attack basically is. So these are obviously some of the networking attacks that can be launched. There's also the human aspect or the social aspect, because if you think about the metaverse, it's basically used by humans, and humans being humans, you can use the technology for good purposes. You can also use it for malicious purposes, right? And it's even more so because the metaverse, everything is virtual. So if it's virtual, a lot of people, they think that, okay, people don't know who I actually am in the real world. If I do something malicious in the virtual world, there are no consequences to me because it's all virtual. People don't actually know who I am. So and you pretty much see this in the social media and the internet that we have nowadays. So things like social engineering, you try to influence other people to doing certain things like scamming, phishing type scams. You have things like user profiling, because again, everything's basically recorded. So you can actually profile a user. Okay, this person is more likely to do certain things, or this person is more likely to be tempted by certain advertisements, and you can target the advertisement to force or to try to convince a person to actually spend money to purchase a certain thing, right? You see this even nowadays, right? If you purchase something on, let's say, Amazon or something, then next day you see that they will try to show you similar products to try to get you to buy them, because they've done a user profiling on you. So obviously it's going to be more immersive and more real in once you have things like the metaverse. Fake news is obviously one of the problematic things that we have in the world nowadays. And in metaverse, it's going to be even worse, because the fact that it's not just fake news in terms of the information that you read, you can generate fake 3D virtual experiences and once you experience something in a three-dimensional experience, typically the human brain will actually believe it. So it's a lot more severe than what we pretty much have now. And other things like the social effects are things like cyberbullying, abuse, and hate. And if you think about this, so this is an example of some of the numbers that is in the current, what we have in the current metaverse at the moment. You can see that every 7 minutes on Facebook's VR chat, there is some online abuse, hatred or some form or another. So Meta also introduced, say, for example, a 4 feet distance, because what they actually found is that there were a lot of complaints when they launched their prototype metaverse, that a lot of people were harassing other people in that virtual. So they were virtually harassing other people. So that's why they introduced this boundary that you cannot actually encroach on within a certain distance from other people. And you can see there's a whole variety of other abuses that can actually occur in the metaverse. So this is really just some numbers of a survey based on the current metaverse that we have. So imagine that you actually have a full-blown metaverse. These numbers will probably increase significantly. Other things that you can actually attack in the metaverse are things like financial situations. So things like NFT, digital currency scams. So if you think about anything to do with finances or currency or money, then you will actually get people that will actually try to exploit these situations. So these are some of the potential threats that are really, really common in these digital threats. So things like pump and dump schemes. So what these try to actually do is they try to get people excited about a certain product or certain asset, and a lot of people will actually buy it because of the fact that there's a lot of hype about it. So once you actually buy that, a lot of people buy it, the price goes really, really high. Then the people that run the scheme, they will actually sell it, they make their money, and then the price will actually crash. And obviously, they don't care about the price crashing because they've already made their money. It's all the other people that were scammed into it that will actually lose all their money. With things like non-fungible tokens, you also have things like fake profiles or fake organizations that pretend to actually offer certain products or services, but they're actually not genuine. There's actually no such product, no such services. There are even scams that you have malicious NFTs where a person has to click on a certain thing to activate their NFT, but once they click on it, it actually activates some malicious thing on their system. So this is basically a lot of the scams that people pretty much have in the financial scams that people can actually do. There's also physical security. So I mentioned previously that the metaverse is not just digital, it also encroaches on the physical world. So they will actually have things like physical threats as well. So what are some of these physical threats that can actually occur? These are like, for example, if you wear these wearable devices and wearable sensors, you can an attacker can actually take over some of these devices or inject certain things into these devices. So to give an example, if you think about, let's say, virtual reality where you're wearing a headset, if a hacker basically gets control over your system, they can actually get it to project certain displays. So for example, they can put some unwanted images that are, scary images or uh, images that can actually cause things like mental trauma. They can actually project this onto the screen. You can even do things like if people suffer from, let's say, epilepsy, for instance, you can cause the screen to flash with a certain frequency that certain people that suffer from epilepsy, they will actually suffer from the consequences of that. You can make the volume so loud that it tries to blow the eardrums. So these are some physical attacks that you can actually perform on these devices. So once a hacker gets control of your system, they can actually inject these things that actually cause you physical damage. Other things they can actually do are things like, let's say, physical disorientation or cyber sickness. So the concept behind this is that when you're wearing some of these virtual reality or augmented reality devices, when you move your head, the images are supposed to actually move in real time. So you're supposed to actually, it's like in real life, when you move your head, you expect your eyes to see a certain thing, or you expect the scene that your eyes sees to actually change. Now, if for instance it doesn't, then your brain is telling you that you're moving a certain way, but your eyes are telling you that you're seeing something else. So that mismatch in the information will actually cause disorientation and cyber sickness. Now, a lot of people are trying to find ways to improve this so that you reduce the speed of the real-time rendering. So when you're wearing a virtual reality headset, you move and your images immediately change so that you don't actually get the cyber sickness. But if a hacker basically gets control of your system, they can deliberately introduce a lag so that when you move your head, the images do not actually move fast enough, and that will actually induce the cyber sickness. So that's something they can actually do. Other physical personal safety concerns are, for example, these are some attacks that people have actually done. If you think about, let's say, the devices that we wear nowadays, so this is basically the Oculus Quest 2. these are actually cameras. So they're actually 4 cameras here, and they're meant for they're cameras that are used for a variety of purposes. For one thing, it's meant for augmented reality, so it captures the real images to try to overlay images on top of the real images. They're meant for tracking as well, to track your head movement. But because of the fact that these are cameras, what a hacker can actually do is they can hack your device and they can actually see through these cameras. So whenever you're using your headset, they can actually see all around you. They can see your bedroom, they can see wherever you're using this headset, they can actually see what is actually in the room around you. So that's what's known as a tracker attack. There are things like what's known as a chaperone attack. Now, whenever you use these devices, what you actually do is you set a virtual boundary around you. So if you look at this image here, you set a virtual boundary around you. And the idea behind the boundary is so that you will not knock into other things, right? When you swing or when you walk, you will not bump into walls, you will not hit other things or break, uh, windows or whatever in the physical world, because you have this virtual boundary. And the idea behind this is once you move or touch the virtual boundary, then the system will actually shut down, or it will actually show you the actual world, so that you will actually avoid knocking something in the real world. But the problem with that is that a chaperone attack, an attacker can actually remove that that virtual boundary, or they can even shift it to somewhere else, and that will actually cause the person using that device to knock into other things, or they can walk into walls and whatever, right? Because the boundaries have either shifted or have been removed. So that's basically another attack. There are other things like what's known as the human joystick attack, and what this attack tries to actually do is that what the researchers actually did is, given that you're in the virtual world, they gradually so for example, if the virtual world is a virtual room, and what they can actually do is they can very slowly, but they can shift the virtual room, because it's all virtual, right? It's not physical. They can actually shift the display of the virtual room, and what they found is that unconsciously, because they do this very slowly, unconsciously, what the human actually does is, to compensate for that slow shifting of the room, the human will actually move physically in the direction of the shift. And this is obviously dangerous, because if you think about this, once the attacker knows your surroundings using something like a tracker attack, they can actually get you to walk towards a stairs and fall down the stairs or something, because they can actually move you to where they actually want you to actually move. If you think about this, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of things like Pokemon Go, right? Pokemon Go. And Pokemon Go, when it first released, it caused a lot of accidents, right? Because people were focused on playing, Pokemon Go, and they walked into traffic, or they were playing it while they were driving, and so it caused a lot of accidents. So similarly, because when you're in that immersive environment and you're using it and you're immersed and you're doing something, unconsciously you will not actually know what your physical self is actually doing. So as I mentioned, if they shift the virtual room slowly, and your physical human self moves in the direction where the room is basically shifting, that's obviously potentially dangerous, because you can actually walk into a whole variety of different things, right? You can walk into traffic, you can fall down the stairs, you can walk into walls or whatever. So that's basically another physical attack that people have shown that it's actually possible. Okay, so that's basically so the first part, obviously, I talked about the metaverse and what it was. The second part, I talked about some of the cybersecurity attacks and cybersecurity concerns that we pretty much have. Now, I'll come to the last part of this talk, part 3, which is basically on the research directions that we can actually go to try to overcome some of these cybersecurity problems in order to actually make the metaverse a reality. So there's a lot of different directions that a lot of people are basically taking in trying to secure the metaverse, or some to overcome some of the problems in the cybersecurity challenges in the metaverse. So some of the high-level general research disciplines are things like cryptography, where obviously you try to secure information in an encrypted form. You have blockchain that tries to ensure security and privacy of data and try to decentralize it away from a central repository. You have decentralized technologies. As I mentioned, decentralized technologies is you try to avoid having a single point of failure. And that's important in the metaverse because metaverse is meant to be global. You don't really want everything to be focused on a certain location or only a selected number of centralized servers. AI-driven cybersecurity, that's a really, really big thing now because a lot of cybersecurity nowadays, you actually want to automate it. You want an AI to detect malicious behavior, malicious patterns, or anomalies in the system. Software-defined networking, that's another huge area as well. And the reason why people look into software-defined networking is because unlike static networks that are fixed, software-defined networking, you can dynamically change the parameters of the networking parameters. So that can potentially avoid some of the things like denial of service type attacks. And other things like cyber physical system security. This is basically the security of systems that are both physical and cyber systems. So if you think about IoT devices or things that are connected, physical devices are connected to the digital systems, then how do you actually secure both the cyber side of it and the physical side of it? So this is where cyber physical security systems basically come in. So these are some of the general areas. Now, what are some of the specific areas that people have actually been looking at? So let me start with authentication and access control. So what this actually tries to do is how do you authenticate and how do you verify that the person is who the person says they are, especially if everything, you have the 3D avatars in the virtual world. How do you know that the person that's represented by the avatar is really the person that they say they are, right? So the idea behind this is because in order to actually interact with the metaverse, you have to wear these wearable sensors, right? You wear a headset, you wear other devices that track your arm movements and so on and so forth. Now, what these devices can actually collect are sensory signals. They can track, for example, where your head is basically looking at. They can track, for example, other things like your gestures, your gait. They can even track other things like your heartbeat, like ECG, for example, or PPG. That's your heartbeat. And the idea behind this is that everyone's signature is different because the way you react to certain things, your brain waves, your the way you stand, the way you interact with things, your heartbeat, all that is basically different. And the idea behind this is to actually use that tracking to make sure that you are actually the person that you say you are. Because if everybody has a different heartbeat, everybody has a different posture and gesture, then you can actually use this with some degree of accuracy. You can actually determine that that person is really the person that they say they are, right? And this is a form of what is known as continuous authentication because unlike a lot of the current systems like password systems, password system is something that you enter the password and you don't actually have to be the person that actually uses the system. You can enter the password for somebody and then you can get your friend to actually use the system because it's a single authentication. You authenticate it once, then you can get somebody else to use the system. Now, continuous authentication is something that you cannot replace it with somebody else because if you're wearing a sensor, for example, you cannot take off the sensor and give it to somebody else. You have to actually constantly be wearing it in order to actually use the system. So this is what people call continuous authentication to ensure that the person is really the person that they say they are and they are the one that are actually currently using it as well because you cannot swap it to somebody else, right? So this is some of the areas that people are trying to look at. This is somewhat similar to if you think about CAPTCHA systems, right? So CAPTCHAs are basically these, traditionally anyway, CAPTCHAs were these distorted text that you had to enter into the keyboard to verify that you were actually a human, not a malicious bot, right? So I'm sure every one of you have seen this before. Now, CAPTCHAs have basically evolved over the years, and this is something that Google has basically come up with, where they pretty much have this system where they're not really tracking you entering the correct text. They're actually more tracking how you interact with the CAPTCHA. And based on that, so for example, based on your mouse movements, they determine whether or not you're human, right? So this is the same thing. It's continuous authentication where they determine based on your behavior whether you are the person that you actually say you are. So this is some of the research directions. AI-driven cybersecurity, this is a huge direction as well, because the idea behind this is that the AI can automatically detect either malicious behavior or anomalies in the system. So if your behavior is different from the normal behavior, or it diverts from what is considered to be normal, an AI tool can actually detect this. And this is a very, very popular area in cybersecurity because of the fact that you don't have physical experts, looking through all this data. You get an AI to actually detect all these anomalies in behaviors or the data. So that's basically another popular direction. There are things like for data management, there are things like dynamic watermarking. And what this concept basically is if you think about the normal watermarking is such that, let's say you have an image. If you try to watermark the image, you try to hide some watermarking information in that image. But the information that you hide, if you crop the image or you resize the image or you filter the image or something, that watermark can potentially be removed. And in fact, in most cases, it's quite easy to actually remove a watermark. Now, dynamic watermarking is a bit different, because what dynamic watermarking tries to actually do is the watermarking is based on things like signals. And the idea behind this is, for example, if you have a cyber physical system where you have these IoT devices, and the IoT devices are supposed to react to certain signals. So if you have a certain private signal that you inject into these IoT devices, by observing the way that the IoT device responds to the signal, you can determine whether or not that device has been tampered with. Because if it reacts the normal way, then you know that the device is secure. But if you inject that signal and the IoT devices behaves differently, you know that there's something wrong with the device. So that's what's known as dynamic watermarking. It's not something that is static that you can easily remove the watermark. For data management, obviously blockchain provenance is another area, because based on the blockchain, you can actually prove whether or not a certain transaction basically happened, because the blockchain is basically a record of all the different transactions that has happened to, let's say, for example, a certain digital asset. So you can actually prove that, for example, the asset belongs to a particular individual. Now, for things like networking, things like, let's say, denial service attacks or Sybil attacks, there are concepts that are known as things like situation awareness, where you want to actually be aware of the behavior of the network at that particular point in time to be able to determine any anomalies in the behavior. And things like software-defined networking and honeynet. So what the concept behind this, and people have actually combined all these techniques together in the sense that based on the situation that you're currently in, the software-defined network is different from the traditional static networks. Static networks are such that the parameters of the network are fixed, they're static, right? Software-defined networking is such that you can change the parameters, because this is all in software. You can actually dynamically change the parameters on the fly based on the situation that you determine yourself to actually be in. So that actually can alleviate some of these denial of service attacks and Sybil attacks, because once you actually detect that there's a potential threat, you can actually change the configuration of the system to divert these attacks to what are known as things like honey nets, which consists of a variety of honeypots. So you think about honeypot, like if you have a honeypot, if you think about a bear will typically go for the honey, for example. So you divert the attacks into these honeypots so that they don't actually interfere with actual system. So these are some of the things that people are actually looking at. Other things for things like privacy sharing and privacy processing are things like differential privacy. So what differential privacy tries to actually do is, instead of sharing information about individuals, because individual information will actually identify who you are, what differential privacy tries to do is collect aggregated information from a group of individuals. So if you group the data together, yes, you don't know the individual information. You still can find out about the information about certain groups, but you don't actually have the individual's information. And that still allows you to find certain trends in the data without revealing the information about specific people, specific individuals. So that's what's known as differential privacy. Other things are like, for example, federated learning. So for those of you, if you're familiar with things like the traditional machine learning is such that you have all your training data to a centralized system that trains a model on all that data, right? Now, if you have a centralized system, all your data needs to be sent to that centralized system in order for it to actually train a machine learning model. Now, federated learning tries to actually overcome that problem because it tries to keep the data on your device itself. And what it actually tries to do is, for example, if everybody has a mobile phone, you keep your mobile phone data on your phone, you train a local model on your phone, and you only send the local model to, let's say, a cloud server. So the data is actually not shared. The data is still on your device, and it's your private data. You do not send your private data at all. You only send a locally trained model to a centralized server, and the centralized server will aggregate the data from everybody's devices. And that way you end up with a globally trained machine learning model without needing to access the data from individual devices. So this is what the idea behind federated learning is. It's a big area in machine learning nowadays. Things like secure multi-party computation, that's another cryptography technique where you try to actually have a function that will actually compute the joint inputs from multiple individuals while not revealing the information of individual data. So collectively, you can still run a function, but you cannot actually get individual data from other people. So this is basically secure multi-party computation. Again, this is another growing area. Homomorphic encryption is basically the concept where if you think about normal encryption, you encrypt data, but you cannot do anything useful with encrypted data because it's encrypted. In order to actually do something useful with encrypted data, you have to decrypt it first, perform whatever operation, and then re-encrypt it back. So that once you decrypt it, then that now becomes plain text, and anybody can actually see that plain text. So what homomorphic encryption tries to do is the computation is actually done in the encrypted domain. So you perform computations in the encrypted domain itself without actually having to decrypt it first and then re-encrypt it back. Now, it's obviously a very useful tool. The problem obviously is that the current homomorphic encryption is very computationally intensive. It takes a lot of computation, so you still cannot do it in real time. So it's a very, very good idea because you can perform computation in the encrypted domain, but the current problem is that it takes a long time. So people are trying to actually speed up the process to actually be able to do it in real time. Another concept known as zero knowledge proof. This is a concept whereby it's a cryptographic concept where you try to prove something without actually knowing the actual information. So there are certain mathematical ways of actually doing this to try to prove something without having to actually uncover the actual information in itself. But a lot of this involves a lot of mathematical proofs, so it's a very complicated area. Now, what about things like social challenges, right? I pretty much mentioned that one of the concerns of the metaverse is social privacy. So what some of the mechanisms that people have actually looked at, so these are a whole variety of different mechanisms. I'll just select some of them. So for example, private copy is where you introduce a mechanism where you create your own private copy of the virtual world. So it's separate from the main virtual world. You create your own private copy and you can invite the people that you want to invite into that private copy. And that private copy basically ensures that you will not actually have third-party virtual cameras like spying on that private copy of your virtual room because it's a private copy. So that's one example. Lockouts are things like areas of the virtual world that other people cannot enter. Only authorized people are basically allowed to enter. Things like what people have argued is that things like teleporting. So if you suspect that somebody is following you in the virtual world, the argument is that you should be allowed to teleport somewhere else so that the person loses track of where you are. So teleporting things like clones and mannequins, these are, for example, to try to confuse virtual stalkers, if you create a fake copy of yourself, like a mannequin, or you create multiple clones of yourself, that basically confuses the attacker because they don't actually know which one is the real, the real you anymore. So these are some of the defense mechanisms that people have actually suggested for overcoming some of these social privacy issues. Other things that people have actually looking at are things like for physical security. There are various things like cyber physical security type systems where you try to have these policies that govern how you secure systems that both combine the cyber side of it and the physical side of things. And a lot of this have to do with certain design principles when you actually develop these systems, so that by designing things a certain way, they actually avoid a lot of the pitfalls or security holes that can potentially occur if you design it without considering some of these situations. And obviously, things like governance and regulations and laws can actually deter attackers as well, because one of the problems that we have is, for example, in the virtual world, there are no laws that govern the virtual world. There are only laws that govern the physical world. But by introducing laws in the physical world, that can actually deter people in the virtual world. So, but there obviously has to be a global consensus on some of these laws, because if you have some countries where certain things are legal, other things are not legal, then people can actually launch some attacks in countries that where this is basically legal. So there has to be some form of mechanism that tries to coordinate some of these governance and laws. So these are some of the research directions. And what I'll do is I'll make some concluding remarks here. So obviously I presented a number of different things. I presented what the metaverse is. I presented the cybersecurity challenges that are present in the metaverse and some of the potential research directions that people are actually looking in to solve some of the challenges in the cybersecurity domain. Now, obviously, the metaverse itself promises a lot of things. It promises a change in people's lifestyle. It's basically promised to be the next evolution in the internet. But obviously, there are a lot of problems that have to be overcome before this can actually happen. Because if the security challenges are not actually overcome, then this becomes a hindrance to the metaverse actually becoming a reality. Because if there are too many problems in the metaverse, then society will be the judge that nobody will actually use it because of these problems. So, will the metaverse become a reality? Most people believe it will, and a lot of this is actually driven by the fact that a lot of the major companies like Facebook, Microsoft, Apple, a lot of them are heavily invested in the metaverse. Now, this is not to say that the metaverse will be the same as what we envision it to actually be, but it could be in a different form. But potentially, it will actually become a reality in it could be in a different form, but some form or other, it can actually become a reality. So these are some references, and I'll basically conclude my talk here. So thanks for your attention, and if anybody have any questions, I'll be happy to chat with you. And we'll hand it back to
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Casey, for the insightful talk. I think there's a lot of information to capture there, and now I think we will open up the floor for any questions. If you would like any for Dr. Casey, you can type in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself.
Thank you for listening.
Anyone have anything you want to share? Any questions on Metaverse, on cybersecurity? Okay, I guess not. All right. Thank you again, Dr. Casey, for your time. I think before we go, the organizers have requested that we take a group photo. So, if possible, could we have everyone switch on your camera for 10 seconds? So it's a thing that we do with these talks nowadays. Just take everybody. Okay, everybody's switching on their cameras. Okay, so far, okay, 1, 2, 3, 8 people. So if you, for the participants, if you don't mind, you can switch on the camera for a while. So we just want to take a group photo and then we'll call it a day. Take a photo. Okay, I think we shall take. Okay, just if you don't mind, just look into the camera for into your own cameras, and we will take the photo in 3, 2, 1. Okay, great. All right, I think thank you everyone for your time. Again, we would like to extend our gratitude to Dr. Casey for sharing with us today. It's been extremely insightful and informative, and I'm sure we will benefit from this because these are things that's really been happening in the last couple of months, a couple of years, and I think moving forward, we definitely live in really exciting times. Okay, so with that, I think we will call it a day. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Thank you again, Dr. Casey, for joining us and for helping, and for the talk. I'm sure we got more coming up in the near future as well. So thank you, everyone. Here's me, I'm Kiat, signing off, UOW Malaysia.
Bye.